April 17, 1998. The date sits like a small, exact stone on the shelf of my life. It was the kind of spring afternoon when the town seemed to move a little slower. Sunlight angled through budding trees, neighbors mowed lawns as if to mark the season, and publicness still felt local rather than global. The narrow white chapel at the edge of town was a former meeting house, its paint softened with time and the private dignity of places people choose when they want rights to feel intimate. Andrew and I invited only immediate family, a few friends, and neighbors who had watched us plant seedlings the fall before. Scout, our small, vigorous dog then, came with us, vocal with that peculiar, urgent joy only a dog can manage. We meant the ceremony to be modest and human, the kind of day you could hold without needing a projection screen. People still ask about that chapel as if it were the hinge of everything, as if a single chord could explain the arc of a life. They want anatomy, the precise note, the exact step that broke the room. In 1998 the internet was not yet everyone's witness, stories traveled by voice, neighbors, relatives, the long chain of small talk. What happened in the chapel was, first and foremost, domestic, a rupture in the language of a song. Andrew is a musician by habit and temperament. When he was nervous he would smooth his hands over strings or keys until the room could find its first chord. That afternoon he had invited a clarinetist friend. They planned to play quietly as people filed in. At the last minute Andrew altered the arrangement, introducing a phrase, a motif lifted from a hymn that, for me, carried the weight of an old absence. It was the hymn that had been sung when my father had been gravely ill and my mother, choosing distance, had stayed in the car and sent a note. For Andrew the choice was tenderness, an acknowledgement of a fissure we had kept private amid the public business of marrying. For my mother it read as accusation. They rose and left before the vows were complete. The sound of their coats punctuated the room. A few relatives tried with flattened politeness to smooth the edges. Scout barked once and settled at my feet. We finished our vows in a hush that felt deliberate. We would not let that public rupture name our union that day. We promised each other the small, necessary things people promise. We pressed rings onto warm fingers and walked into the sunlight as a married couple. What followed in the neighborhood, and later in panels and festival conversations, was a customary human reflex. People turned the event into a story about provocation, about the ethics of art, about music's power to reveal history. Some called Andrew theatrical, others faulted my parents for hypersensitivity. Both lines of critique missed the point of what the afternoon forced us to choose, and choose quickly, the kind of family we wanted to be. The chapel did not produce philosophy so much as compulsion. We could have traded that afternoon as currency, retelling it to prove who had been right. Instead we chose a slower, less spectacular labor. We practiced restraint that shaped many subsequent choices. Scout had been with us long before the chapel, the household's honest censor and background breath. Small in stature and large in habit, he bumped his head against a hip for attention, stretched in a sliver of sunlight at the kitchen table, asked for modest ministrations, a leash, a treat, a lap. When his breathing thinned and the spring light slid differently through the blinds, we did what you do for what you love. We sat on cool tile, spoke with our veterinarian, and held him as tenderness met efficiency. Andrew stroked Scout's ears in a habitual motion. Our child, then little and quiet in the doorway, leaned there, face lit by a small private sorrow. My mother did not attend. There was no scene. We buried Scout under the olive tree in the backyard that my father had helped me plant years before when a different hope still felt possible. The ceremony was a shovel, a handful of soil, a few words. We said nothing that needed to be recorded. If the chapel had been a public rupture, Scout's burial taught a different lesson. Grief need not prove itself. Sometimes sheltering a tender life from spectacle is the truest act of love. My mother's absence at the burial did not become a moral indictment, it simply was. Grief resists formatting into argument. You cannot make a private meal into a public feast without breaking it. By late spring of 2004 I began teaching a community writing initiative at the local center. The program, born of a small grant and a belief that memoir can be both craft and care, paired adults and teenagers to explore remembrance with restraint. Twice weekly I taught in a room with peeled paint and bright fluorescent lights, not because I fancied myself a pedagogue, but because the work felt like a continuation of the private labor we practiced at home. Keep watch, make language where language was difficult, bear witness without turning a wound into spectacle. Andrew would stop by before evening shifts at the bakery or after community music nights. He would play a few chords while people filtered in. That reliable, slightly offbeat sound signaled we were beginning something ordinary and humane. The teenagers were a mix, some writing essays for college, some already living parts of their lives in public through the new grammar of social media, others simply curious about finding a voice. We spoke concretely about memory as excavation and restraint. I told them, in sentences shaped by practice, that truth does not license infliction. Telling a hurt is not permission to stage it. There is a difference between testimony offered to help the world and testimony offered to score a private victory. One student wrote a line I repeat often: truth is an emergency that asks for a plan. He scrawled it at the bottom of a page of hurried sentences, and it lodged in my head like a stone. It distilled the posture we were inventing after the chapel: anticipate trouble, choose readiness rather than spectacle. We rehearsed planning in small ways: how to announce a hard thing to someone who can bear it, how to time revelation as you would prepare a bridge before crossing a ravine. Preserve dignity, your own and others, as an organizing principle. The class became an extension of our kitchen table conversations and clarified the lessons we were trying to live. The child grew into years that asked different forms of attention. We learned to approach milestones carefully: graduations we decided who would attend, birthday parties with guest lists favoring presence over performance, small rituals of affection in microwaves and late-night calls. My mother was occasionally invited to campus events and sometimes declined, sometimes came with a carefully chosen gift and a glance that felt like approval, and at other times sent a photograph taken from afar with a text that suggested she still misunderstood our earlier requests about privacy. These were not easy decisions. We compartmentalized life into what we said aloud and what we kept in the small, private room of the house at midnight. Privilege and exhaustion taught us modes of tolerance. My mother's occasional presence at milestone events was, whenever it happened, both a gift and a test. We accepted what could be accepted and refused what would have demanded of our child an economy of emotional labor we were unwilling to impose. The 2010s sharpened the question of publicness. Social media amplified private wounds into public currency. Audiences wanted spectacle and clarity. People sometimes invited me to speak about family ethics and privacy. Audiences misread our posture. Some accused us of performing restraint for effect, others praised our refusal to feed the machinery of spectacle. I learned to live with irony. My measure always returned to the domestic. Did our choices make our child's life safer and more dignified? If yes, then arguments from those who wanted our private morality turned into public performance were not compelling. Parenting, at its core, is not glamorous. Its most consequential acts barely look like heroism: steady attention to a child whose shoes are too small, quietly defending them from rumor, insisting that privacy is a form of respect. Tenderness surprised us through its smallness. I remember a rainy October afternoon years later, a lasagna made on a whim, plates passed and sometimes dropped with the practiced rhythm of shared meals. My mother spotted a hairline crack in a serving dish and insisted on fixing it. Some people repair objects as if the act could also mend a larger world. Before she left, she kissed the child's forehead. No trumpet of reconciliation, no ceremonial speeches. A modest gesture given weight by repetition. These are the repairs that require no proof. The long arc after Scout's burial involved both continuity and change. In 2015, our child moved to a city a few hours away, a place that suited their work and inclination towards small urban gardens. They lived with a partner who played clarinet in an amateur ensemble, sometimes badly, sometimes beautifully, and who came home on weekends laden with vegetables from a co-op, a practical generosity that becomes inseparable from affection. Photographs of a balcony with herbs in mismatched pots, messages about an apartment with skylight, voice memos of laughter over small domestic calamities. These quotidian details stitched themselves into proof that the habits of care we cultivated had migrated and adapted. My mother grew older in a different cadence, marked not by scandal but by subtle decay. Visits became less frequent and more cautious. At first the slips were small: a forgotten name, a recipe that faltered, a line of history that blurred where it had once been fluent. We noticed them as quirks, then as patterns requiring tending. Doctor visits accumulated, pillboxes were reorganized, and negotiations over home help schedules introduced a practical grief. Andrew and I divided the labor the way we'd learned to. He took on logistics with a patient voice, handling agencies and calendars, while I handled conversations requiring steadier hands. We hired a companion who came twice a week. Because we had practiced building supports, the referral process proved less fraught than it might have been. The companion liked my mother in ways that surprised us, finding shared joy in crosswords and the golden light of old movies, corridors through which my mother's personality could still walk. There were evenings of lucidity that made you think the slope might halt. She would sit on the couch and ask about the wedding as if we had never discussed the chapel incident, patching fragments of conversation into a pattern at once rehearsed and raw. Sometimes she asked about our child's safety with the controlled urgency of someone trying to protect at a distance. Will they be all right? Did you expect trouble? Other times her questions moved toward apology, though never theatrical. Once, in a low voice, she said, "I wore black because I didn't know how to show up otherwise." It was not a complete confession but a map of a life governed by shame and fear, the conviction that spectacle could substitute for the harder work of participation. I had a practiced response. Fear and grief can drive people to use spectacle as their sole tool. She listened, then said simply, "I was afraid." Small and enormous, the phrase opened a space for work that did not demand performative apology but required patient, ongoing being with. Music, the very thing that had once unmoored a chapel, found a new role in that house. Andrew, who had introduced the charged motif years before, brought his playing into quieter rooms. He sat at the old piano after dinner and found small arpeggios that threaded through the house like a moth flitting from lamp to lamp. On nights when speech was brittle, he played simple ballads or hymns arranged without ostentation. His fingers moved. Sometimes my mother closed her eyes and put a hand to the piano wood as if to check the instrument's reality, as if music could confirm something words no longer could. It was instructive to see that what once could wound could, in a different situation, return as balm. One afternoon, exhausted from appointments, my mother asked about the piece Andrew had once played at community nights, the one that had emptied a chapel. With a crooked smile she said, "Was that the one?" I nodded. She exhaled and said, "It sounded like you were saying something I couldn't hear." It was not a tidy apology, but an acknowledgement. Her presence had been governed by fear. I demanded no more. The work that mattered required repetition, being present, again and again. As cognition declined, we altered expectations and learned a grammar of smallness. We stopped insisting on neat conversations and spoke in a language of care, folding napkins and leaving them by a plate, warming a sweater and placing it on a chair, setting a plate of childhood macaroni and cheese within reach. Cultural narratives insist closure must be spectacular. Most of life's closing is stubbornly ordinary. It is a hand held in a hospital corridor, a song drifting into the white space of an afternoon, the decision to decline photographs. We were deliberate about who we let into those intimate rooms. The chapel incident had been retold at many a dinner table. We chose to protect my mother's last years from gossip. Privacy, in the end, felt like an ethical posture for both her and our child. When my mother died on a rain-smudged morning, March 12, 2019, Andrew had parked under the awning to spare her the walk. She slipped away while the three of us listened to music without words, a slow movement that felt like a kitchen chair folding back, the sound of a room taking a breath. Afterward we carried out modest rituals we had planned, a small service with a compact guest list and, following my mother's lucid request, the omission of grand speeches that would have relitigated old pain. People brought flowers. The child's partner read a passage about grace. A neighbor from the community center brought a casserole. Longtime friends told short, true stories about my mother's humor and the light she could bring on her best days. No one used the chapel incident as a cudgel or a final verdict. That felt in itself like mercy. Practicalities arrived in slow procession. Legal notices, handfuls of letters like paper ghosts, boxes to sort. Tucked in an album, we found a card my mother had written years before and never given me. It was a small note about a dinner. At the bottom she had scrawled, in a hand that trembled with age, "Be kind to them." Not a great apology, not a manifesto, but a modest directive, moral residue. It reminded me that people are more complicated than the headlines that reduce them, and that the moral work of life mostly happens in acts too small for a camera. In the months after the funeral, Andrew's music slipped back into ordinary life. He played on porches and at community readings, at benefit events that required soft, non-pressured sound. Our child married in June 2022 in a backyard ceremony we kept intimate. The guest list was intentional, the speeches few. My mother could not have attended even if she had lived. We kept the public parts concise and asked for no moral performances. The song that once emptied a chapel resurfaced in other keys, not to wound but to anchor. Music and love became instruments for making space rather than staking moral claims. When I draw a line from that white chapel to the piano in our living room, the value of our domestic decisions becomes clearer. We protected what mattered, testified where testimony served the public good, and used our child's dignity as a lodestar. Those choices did not wash away every bruise or produce an unbroken record of rectitude. We lost patience sometimes. There were evenings when I resented my mother's silence as much as her actions. Andrew and I sometimes diverged and had to talk through our values. Those disagreements were domestic and persistent, the sorts of quarrels that reveal a life's contours more than any single spectacle could. The work of love involves persistence in the face of small failings. If there is an abiding lesson, it is smaller and more useful than dramatic condemnation or unalloyed defense. The daily practices of care, scheduling tenderness, assembling institutional scaffolds, choosing privacy intentionally, are the slow work of repair. Where spectacle seeks verdicts to satisfy a crowd, home seeks continuity. We made a life that could endure not because we were flawless, but because we learned to turn toward the quiet necessities of presence. That means answering a phone at 3 a.m, sitting through awkward medical consultations, preparing meals for someone whose appetite has waned. It means protecting a young person's privacy when others would have turned their pain into public teaching. It means letting some wrongs rest so rest becomes soil for future repair. Many small practices helped. We made lists, contact numbers for doctors, a folder of medical directives, a shoebox for legal papers. We rehearsed conversations softly so that, when a hard doctor's visit arrived, we could speak without unmooring into panic. We practiced saying, "Not now," in ways that felt like protection rather than denial. When an acquaintance asked about the chapel and sought a demeaning detail, we had a calm reply: we had chosen to protect a child's dignity. That answer rarely satisfied a hungry audience, but it satisfied us. We taught our child boundaries in practical, humane ways. You do not have to broadcast every injustice to be moral. You gather evidence, act strategically, choose your moment if you speak. You return calls, write an apologetic letter when warranted, arrange visits so care can be shared. These lessons are not glamorous, but they are sturdy. I watched our child translate them into adult life, defending a colleague with discretion rather than a social media campaign, accepting help and giving it without theatrics. They learned the rhythms of ordinary reliance. In the community writing program, we taught teenagers to notice the same thing. The story that makes someone else better off is not the one that wins attention, but the one that makes possible a life of respect. We had them write minor events in the detail usually reserved for epics: a humiliating bus ride, a tired teacher's gesture of care, a small adolescent courage. Patient sentences turned these moments into the lore of a life. They learned slowly that the heart is best described in ordinary verbs: to make, to fix, to return, to stay. We did not pretend the outside world was innocent. Public conversation can correct wrongs. It can also calcify pain into narratives that leave the living little room to repair. We kept some of our life small so our child would have room to grow without an edge of outrage around their neck. The chapel incident remained a test case in our community. People would bring it up, hungry for a lesson. I would say the same sentences in public: speak truth without cruelty. Sometimes listeners looked disappointed. That was not our concern. Our concern was the life we intended to maintain. Small rituals sustain me. On Thursdays, our child calls with an improvised format: a check-in, a report on whether balcony plants survived, a recounting of a small kindness. Andrew and I exchanged trivial updates: whether the drain was fixed, whether Scout's old collar turned up in a drawer. Those small exchanges are the warp and weft of domestic life, hardly interesting to strangers, but what keeps a family functioning. They are the antidote to believing dramatic gestures are the only measure of love. If there is a final thought I offer, it is this: Human life is an economy of attention. We decide, often without drama, how much of ourselves to expose and how much to protect. Those decisions are morally significant, they are quiet work of repair. Spectacle can feel like a moral instrument because it insists on clarity, winners and losers, a resolution that looks decisive. But steady care, showing up, arranging pillboxes, teaching a child to argue without shaming, builds a life that endures. That is the music I choose now, not the loud chord that once chased people from a chapel, but the unassuming melody that sat in the background of an ordinary, final afternoon, a lullaby that made room for a goodbye that required no audience. The lullaby settled into the furniture of our lives the way a certain light settles into a northern room, slow, dependable, and not always noticed until one day you realize it has been there for months. In the months after my mother's death, that small, wordless repertoire became a companion to ordinary grief. Andrew would stumble into the tune in the middle of making coffee and stop short as if surprised it had arrived. The child would whistle it while folding laundry. It was not a resolute answer to everything, merely a steadying presence, a cadence by which we measured ordinary days. The calendar provided structure, the outside world continued to churn. In March 2020, the city shut non-essential spaces briefly, then with more commitment than anyone thought it would sustain. Community centers boarded windows. The weekly elders group began meeting on screens that jittered and froze. Andrew learned to play for cameras. He set up the piano by the window so daylight could soften the image, and he learned the language of online intimacy, to speak a single sentence before a piece, to let his hands rest visibly on the keys between songs, to make space for a comment box reading "Thank you" or "My mother loved that." He found ways to let the charged motif, the one that had once emptied a chapel, live as a texture rather than a claim. He would begin a program with neutral material, then swerve into the motif transposed into a different mode, where its recognition felt like a wink rather than an accusation. People wrote in that a song had reminded them of a childhood they had resisted feeling. Some wrote that it had made them cry softly, a private thing in a crowded house. We did not track the analytics. We tracked the letters that arrived in the mailbox. An elderly woman who had been unable to play the piano for years and now played along on the recorder she had dug out of her closet. A teenager who said a live stream had been the first time she felt less alone in quarantine. The pandemic tightened our sense of what mattered and what could wait. We postponed some public projects, accelerated others. The writing program we ran shifted to weekly prompts delivered by email. One of those prompts asked students to write a letter to the person they would be in 5 years. The letters that came back, years later when I kept a file of them, read like small constellations of promise. A student who had been unmoored by foster care wrote, "I will learn to keep the groceries in the same cupboard," and meant it as a claim to stability. Another wrote, "I will be able to say not now and mean it." Those sentences, modest as they were, became seeds for the workshops we taught in later seasons. In September 2021, an op-ed in the local paper revisited the chapel incident. It was not vicious. The writer tried to be even-handed, reconstructing our family's choices as a case study in privacy and public accountability. Some readers took to the comments with historical certainties. Others asked questions in good faith. I wrote a short reply, not a defense, but a statement of values, that we had chosen, as a family, to prioritize the child's dignity, to keep certain damages from calcifying into identity. That reply was small and precise. I dated it and sent it. It calmed a few acquaintances and inflamed a few strangers. The piece circulated on social media platforms with predictable distortions. For a week or two the narrative of the chapel was a curiosity again, the subject of late-night talk and second-hand outrage. We did not join the spectacle. Our refusal to indulge a courtroom of commentators felt like the continuation of a moral posture, not an avoidance of accountability. In the quieter registers of life, things continued to shift. The child's marriage in June 2022 took place, as recorded in the file folder I still keep, on a Saturday afternoon when the roses on the backyard fence had finally decided to open. The guest list was exacting by design, the speeches were few, the music circumspect. Andrew played pieces that were part lullaby, part invocation, part domestic hymn. There was no attempt to rewrite the past into a performance of reform. What mattered was the presentness of those at the party. The child's chosen relatives, their closest friends, neighbors who had shown up routinely during hard winters with casseroles and a readiness to fix a leaking gutter. The ceremony included a quiet moment when we each spoke a sentence about the future to the couple. Mine was simple and practical. We will be at your door at 3 a.m. if you call. My mother would not have been there. The thought of her absence lingered like a shadow, and we did not pretend otherwise. Autumn 2022 brought other demands. An old neighbor died and left the child a collection of photographs that we sorted on a Sunday. The shoebox of legal papers we had assembled years before. Doctors' numbers, a list of who had keys, a thin, practical medical directive, proved a comfort. There is an economy to these materials. They anchor procedures to persons. In October, a former student who had taken our workshop as a teenager wrote to say they were starting a small program of their own for teens in a neighboring town. They asked for guidance and a modest stipend. I found myself giving away things I had once charged for, a prompt that worked, an exercise to coax detail, a way of reading so that shame did not become the center of a sentence. A sense of repair can be transmitted in pedagogy as well as in care. We gave the stipend. We continued to choose privacy when it protected a person rather than obscured wrongdoing. That difference mattered ethically and practically. In March 2023, a distant cousin phoned to say they were thinking of writing a book about families who hide things. I said no. The cousin persisted politely. There is a hunger for scandal in print. I explained that my mother had been more than a single act and that the story we intended to preserve was not one of spectacle. The cousin asked, "Are you afraid of the truth?" I replied, "No. I'm afraid of what the truth will do when it has to carry everything about a living person." He understood, dimly, and the project went elsewhere. The refusal felt like a thin but honest boundary. As the years moved toward 2024, Andrew's music found new public places. He was invited to a city remembrance for those lost to opioid overdose. He agreed to play, but he asked for a strict understanding. 10 minutes, no speeches that named names, no moralizing. The organizers agreed. They knew his work and the kind of attention he brought. He played a program that began with a hymn for steady hands and moved into the motif, now shorn of its accusatory edge, arranged as a counter-melody that allowed the crowd to breathe. Some people cried openly, others nodded without tears, their faces set in private grief. Afterwards, strangers thanked Andrew for not dramatizing. For him it was a small victory, to let music hold grief without turning it into argument. There were moments when the past intruded in ways we had not anticipated. In June 2024, an old recording of the chapel performance surfaced on a streaming site. It had been taken by someone in the back pews with a recorder and uploaded later, perhaps out of a belief that the world needed an eyewitness. The file traveled through digital networks and became, for a few turbulent days, a point of renewed conversation. Some commenters used it as proof that my mother had been monstrous. Others used it as proof she had been misunderstood. Our child, married now and grown in ways my mother never saw, called late at night and said, "Do you want us to answer?" The answer was no. We had made a family decision some years before, to launch no campaign that would make private life a public spectacle. We did not want our child's sense of self tethered to a replayed humiliation. We did, however, choose to intervene when the public conversation threatened to deform the context of the event beyond recognition. A local journalist called, asking for background and for a fuller portrait of who my mother had been. That call was different. It was not an invitation to score her further. I agreed to speak, on the condition that my comments be placed in a feature that would also cover the city's approach to memory and the ethics of reportage. The journalist agreed. We met in January 2025 at a coffee shop that still served real sugar cubes. He listened. We talked about the way people become icons or villains, how social media telescopes a moment into a verdict. He included the odd, small fact that calmed me, that my mother had a habit of writing errand notes in the margins of newspaper obituaries, a human smallness that complicated categorical judgments. The feature ran with a headline that balanced curiosity with restraint. The social media spike subsided. Our decision to refuse spectacle did not mean we had no appetite for accountability. It meant we sought forms of repair that could produce concrete good rather than circulate recrimination. When an organization my mother had once been involved with asked to fund a pilot program for teenagers who had experienced family trauma, we accepted an invitation to consult. We were not looking for restitution, we were interested in practical outcomes. The program, launched in the autumn of 2025, combined writing workshops with legal clinics and a small fund for emergency housing. It was modeled on what we had learned in the quiet work at home, that dignity requires scaffolding. Our child gave a talk at the program's first convening in October 2025, and I watched them speak with a directness that did not require vindication. Their sentences were modest and fierce. Afterwards, several teenagers thanked them for refusing to make their pain performative. Music continued to be a fulcrum. Andrew's pieces were played at small funerals and at readings. Occasionally a newspaper would ask him to play a little as part of a profile, and he would clear the content with us first. In March 2026, he accepted an invitation to score a short film about ordinary acts of care during crises. The director wanted a sound that could hold both tenderness and the knowledge of limits. Andrew wrote for strings and piano and, in a couple of bars, echoed the motif transposed into a comma key. When the film screened at a local festival in May 2026, an audience member came up after and said he had been afraid at first that the music would turn things into a trial. Instead, he said, it made him think of his aunt who had dressed up to visit a hospital room and then sat in silence for an hour. That kind of listener's recognition felt, to us, like a moral validation of a particular kind, not of our choices as absolutes, but of our capacity to create spaces where complex people could be seen whole. There is no single method for holding that complexity. Some public moments demand a full accounting, some private ones require restraint. In our household, we tried to apply an ethics of proportion. When a neighbor asked, in July 2026, whether we would host a small town hall-like conversation about restorative practices and the limits of public shaming, we accepted. The event was modest in attendance, perhaps 50 people in a church basement, a room that smelled faintly of coffee and old paint. I was asked to open with a story about a single small ritual that had mattered to me in my mother's final months. I told the story of the folded napkins, the warmed sweater, the card that read "Be kind to them." People listened. Afterwards, a woman in the back told me she had once been the recipient of a public denunciation that had left her life impoverished. She said that learning about small reparative practices gave her hope for a way out. A man who worked at a local paper asked how institutions might design responses that allowed for rehabilitation. The conversation was uneven and long. It did not resolve into policy, but it did seed several projects: a hotline for families navigating difficult disclosures, a small fellowship for journalists to cover sensitive stories with longer timelines. We continue to live within those choices. On the mantel in our living room there is a small framed note my mother wrote years before, the one that said "Be kind to them," and beside it a typewritten pamphlet we gave at the October program, How to Hold Someone's Story Without Owning It. The pamphlet begins with practical instructions, a phone number, a doctor's contact, and ends with an insistence that a person is never reducible to a single incident. That axiom has not always felt easy to uphold. Sometimes I find myself angry at how little the pamphlet says about culpability. Sometimes Andrew and I disagree about whether to speak when someone from the past reemerges in a public role. Those disagreements are small and ongoing. They are how we test our principles. We have learned to argue with curiosity rather than with the aim of defeating the other. That kind of argument teaches the contours of our lives. The music, over time, has taught us similar lessons. A motif can be used to wound or to call attention to a need. It can clear a room or make the air purer. The ethics of use, who plays it when, for what audience, matters. I do not believe art is neutral. I do believe it is polyvalent. In some contexts the same chord can be a rebuke, in others it can be a salve. We have chosen to treat art as part of our domestic toolkit, something to summon when a situation calls for steadiness, something to display spectacle when we want privacy, something to play softly in the background of a life that is trying, in small and persistent ways, to be decent. There are tasks still to do. We will continue to teach teenagers the craft of noticing. We will keep making small lists and rehearsing awkward medical conversations. We will continue to decline offers that aim to make our family a case study for entertainment. We will say yes to projects that build actual capacity for repair. The child will have children someday, perhaps, and we will hope to give them the same set of tools we were gifted: an ethics of proportion, a language for small acts of care, a sense that privacy can be a form of respect. Andrew will keep playing the piano in rooms where people need to find their breath again. We will keep deciding, as circumstances require, whether the charged motif is appropriate or not. We will keep living by the small directive my mother left in her shaky handwriting: be kind to them. The word them is capacious enough to include victims and offenders, grief and stubborn human contradictions, the neighbors and the strangers who pass through our lives, and it is the instruction we have tried to honor even when honoring has been difficult and partial. We have not found absolution, we have found practices. We will continue to practice. We will continue to practice. In December 2026, before the year's light died, we sat with a binder of the pilot program's early metrics and the names of 48 teenagers who had completed the first cycle of workshops. The binder smelled faintly of coffee and photocopier toner and had margin notes in my handwriting where I had scratched down what had surprised me: the number of teens who wrote about small acts, a neighbor bringing soup, the adult who answered the phone when no one else would, rather than grand apologies or public reckonings. The legal clinic file included 3 cases in which an emergency housing grant, allocated after a social worker assessment, had prevented eviction. None of the figures were dramatic enough for headlines. They were, however, enough. When we tallied the first-year outcomes in late January 2027, the board of the community organization voted to extend the pilot for 18 months and to seek matching funds from a regional foundation. That vote set a pattern. Between February and June 2027, we helped shape a proposal that emphasized modest but measurable goals: 35 more workshop slots, a rotating stipend for teen writers, 2 part-time social workers, and a small research agreement with a university social work program to track outcomes. The university team, led by Dr. Mara Iglesias, proposed a mixed methods evaluation that would combine surveys with longer interviews. We accepted the plan because it meshed with a principle we had articulated in the pamphlet: repair should be attentive to the actual conditions of people's lives. In September 2027, the program, now named the Restorative Youth Project, reopened under a small non-profit umbrella. The first annual report, released in March 2028, documented that 127 young people had passed through at least one workshop over 18 months and that over 300 crisis calls had been fielded through the hotline seeded after the July 2026 town hall. The numbers were modest in the scale of social policy, but they mattered to the individuals whose lives they touched. Andrew, meanwhile, continued to test the possibilities and limits of the motif. In the spring of 2027, he was invited to compose a short suite for a hospice program affiliated with the city hospital. The hospice director had seen him play at a memorial and asked if his music could be used in bedside listening sessions. Andrew agreed with the same stipulations he had set before: short segments, consent from families, no recording for distribution. He wrote a piece of 5 movements, each under 3 minutes, that could be looped or deployed quietly in a room. At a training session for hospice aides in June 2027, he played the suite on a small upright piano in a sunroom. One of the aides, who had worked with terminal patients for 20 years, said afterward that the music allowed some families to talk when they otherwise could not. This, again, felt like a measure of the work we were trying to do: art that facilitated conversation without becoming the conversation. Public attention, when it came, usually returned to the chapel recording and to the image that people conjured when they thought of my mother's black dress at the wedding. An image that, for some reason, had taken on the status of a symbol. That symbol continued to circulate. In October 2027, a historian writing about rights of marriage in late capitalist American towns quoted my insistence, in the January 2025 interview, that a person is never reducible to a single incident. Her chapter placed our family story beside other cases where an otherwise private rupture became emblematic of broader social anxieties about accountability and spectacle. The historian's treatment was careful. She interviewed scholars and activists and concluded that the ease with which social media turns private gestures into public exemplars required new civic practices. The chapter reached a limited academic audience, and in December a small regional newspaper reprinted a long excerpt. For a week the old recording circulated again in comment threads, but the tone of the conversation had shifted. More people discussed systems and less people sought personal vengeance. Not all returns were so circumspect. In February 2028, an op-ed writer argued that our refusal to litigate my mother's failings in public amounted to a failure of responsibility. The piece prompted 2 responses I remember clearly. The first was an email from a woman who had been helped by the Restorative Youth Project. She wrote that the program had kept her in school and away from an abusive household. The second was a careful letter from a former parishioner of the chapel where the wedding had occurred, addressed to the editor and to anyone who would read it. He wrote about small acts of kindness my mother had once performed for elderly congregants, about rides to doctor's appointments, and about a stubborn, ill-disciplined generosity that did not excuse harm but complicated the narrative into which people wanted to fit her. Both letters reminded me that public argument often flattens the lived texture of lives. By mid-2028, our household had new calibrations. The pamphlet, How to Hold Someone's Story Without Owning It, had been adapted into a short training module used in the youth workshops and, with permission, in a mandatory orientation for new fellows at the journalism program that had been seeded after the town hall. The fellowship itself, launched in early 2028 with support from the local paper and a small philanthropic grant, paid a journalist for a 6-month residency to develop long-form reporting on sensitive community stories. The first fellow, a reporter named Kofi Mensah, produced a series in which he interviewed families, social workers, and institutional leaders about the ethics of disclosure. He sometimes met us in coffee shops. He often read our pamphlet aloud and asked politely whether we had regrets. We had many. We also had principles that, imperfect as they were, aimed to avoid making personal punishment into public entertainment. On a personal level, the household changed in ways that felt at once ordinary and decisive. In August 2028, our child, who had spoken at the October 2025 convening, brought home a baby. They named the child Rosa, after a grandmother on their other side. I remember the date, August 11, 2028, as one of those small historical facts that organizes memory. The baby's presence reframed our calculations about privacy and example. We wanted Rosa to grow up knowing that people are complicated, but that complexity does not absolve harm. We wanted stories that taught her how to be present without being performative, to notice without making spectacle. In the fall of 2028, we drafted a letter for family circulation that spelled out our desires for the child's early years. No public retellings of family trauma without unanimous consent, limits on social media posting, an option for Rosa to hear family stories on her own timeline. The letter read more like a covenant than a policy, but it functioned as a guide. Andrew's music became, in those years, a ledger of possibility. In November 2028, he was commissioned to write a brief work for a civic remembrance of a factory collapse that had occurred in 1986, an event still raw in the town's collective memory. He insisted that the program include not only names but also a moment for workers to speak about conditions that had not been addressed. The committee accepted, albeit with hesitation. On the night of the remembrance, Andrew played the motif transposed into a deliberately neutral key, and a union organizer used the intermission to make a practical ask: improved safety inspections. The organizer's request was heard and later included in a city council agenda item. I was surprised by how small, musical choices could nudge a room toward concrete policy conversation rather than moral display. Still, the past surfaced in ways that tested us. In March 2029, a documentary filmmaker approached us about a short film on family reckonings. The filmmaker wanted the chapel footage included as a turning point. We declined. He offered to anonymize details and to focus on systems, but the presence of the recording as evidence worried us. We had made a family decision years before, to refuse spectacle, and that decision held. The filmmaker respected it and made a different film, one in which he interviewed archivists and restorative justice practitioners about process rather than persons. The film toured a handful of festivals in late 2029 and 2030 and prompted panels about institutional response and memory work. Scarcely any of this felt like absolution. In May 2029, we learned that a municipal board had decided, after a 2-year review, to change the way it trained staff to handle disclosures of historic wrongdoing. The change included mandatory continuing education for personnel in housing and social services and a requirement that public-facing statements be reviewed with an ethicist when a case was sensitive. We were told the policy shift had been prompted in part by testimony at a public hearing where advocates cited, obliquely, the kind of harms that occur when private life is consumed for rhetoric. I confess that the news offered a small, complicated relief, policy without spectacle, if you will. It did not erase what had happened. It did not make my mother's choices less painful for those she had hurt. It did, however, redirect some energies toward training and prevention. The motif itself continued to travel. In January 2030, Andrew released a recording, not of the chapel performance, but of a suite of pieces he had written across the decade, and the liner notes included a short essay about use and consent. The distribution was modest. He released it through a small label that specialized in music for contemplative practice. The album was later used in a workplace program at a regional hospital to train staff in de-escalation and listening. What mattered, repeatedly, was not the music alone but the frameworks we attached to it: consent protocols, contextual notes, limits on distribution. In that sense, the music functioned as an instrument that required policies as much as artistry. By the spring of 2030, the Restorative Youth Project had stabilized and was mentoring similar initiatives in nearby counties. The research team published an article summarizing 3-year outcomes: increased use of legal clinic services when needed, improved school attendance among participants, and a qualitative increase in participants' sense of agency in telling their stories. The study was careful to state limitations. It did not claim causation for broad social change, only that specific supports had tangible effects for young people navigating trauma. We used the study to lobby for modest public funding, and in September 2030 the county approved a 2-year grant to expand the hotline to late-night hours. These increments of public investment felt, in historical terms, like the kind of slow accretion that eventually reshapes institutions. At home, the small disagreements continued. Andrew and I still sometimes found ourselves on opposite sides of the question of exposure. He would argue earnestly that there are occasions when public reckoning is necessary to prevent repetition. I would say, equally earnestly, that there are other occasions when restraint preserves relational possibility. Our arguments rarely resolved into tidy positions. They taught us to ask better questions. We developed a practice of delaying public statements for 48 hours, of convening a small circle of advisors when major disclosures loomed, and of insisting on consent for any use of personal materials by third parties. Those procedural habits were, in their way, the family's moral architecture. The chapel recording surfaced again once more, in a muted fashion, in November 2030, when a graduate student writing a dissertation on the role of music in public memorials cited it as an example of how live performance can shift the tenor of an event. The student contacted us and asked permission to quote from our earlier interviews. We agreed to be part of the scholarly conversation, and she later acknowledged that our insistence on context had shaped her analysis. It was a small, academic footnote, nothing like the viral outcry of 2024. The comparison between those two moments taught me something about time, that passions, even righteous ones, cool or are refracted by intervening practices. Not always. Sometimes records continue to sting. But sometimes the passage of years affords a reconfiguration that permits different kinds of work. We mark anniversaries now with ordinary acts. On the 3rd anniversary of the pilot program's launch, October 2028, by our accounting, we invited past participants to a modest gathering. Some returned as volunteers. In October 2030, another such gathering included a table where teenagers who had graduated from the workshops offered to mentor current cohorts in writing exercises. The mentor program, started informally, became a formal component in early 2031. I noted that the reciprocal structure, those once helped now helping, changed the power dynamics in a meaningful way. 3 decades from now, someone might write a case study about small, localized responses to public shaming and the ethics that guide them. They might include our pamphlet as an artifact or the hospice suite Andrew wrote as evidence of art's potential. They might trace a line from that chapel performance to institutional reforms or to the quiet dignity of a hotline operator who stayed on the line through the night. They might also note the kind of inertia we learned to guard against, the human appetite for simple narratives and for moral demonstrations. For now, though, our chronology proceeds in practical steps: training sessions in spring, fundraising deadlines in late summer, the child school plays and parent-teacher meetings, the occasional op-ed, and the ongoing work of keeping family stories from collapsing into spectacle. We will keep showing up for that work. We will keep organizing our responses around what can be repaired rather than what can be broadcast. We will keep saying no when an offer to tell our story feels like a trap, and yes when the work produces measurable help for someone in need. We will teach Rosa, when she is old enough, that kindness is a practice that requires limits and that listening often matters more than judgment. Andrew will continue to place the motif carefully, sometimes absenting it entirely when the moment calls for silence. I will continue to write small notes into the margins of obituaries and errands, keeping alive that peculiarly human habit that once complicated public verdicts. We will continue to live by be kind to them, knowing the phrase sometimes fails us, and knowing also that iteration, not absolution, will be our path forward. We will continue to live by be kind to them, knowing the phrase sometimes fails us, and knowing also that iteration, not absolution, will be our path forward. In the winter of 2031, our calendar folded into the routines that structure small organizations, grant reports, volunteer training, a retreat for hotline staff held January 14th to 16th at a community center 2 towns over. On January 14th, I sat on a panel with a clinician and a former participant who had become a counselor. We read excerpts from the covenant we had drafted in 2028 and answered questions about boundary setting. The room was neither large nor glamorous, and the presence of a municipal social worker delegate from the county felt, to my surprise, like a quiet acknowledgement that our modest practices had been noticed. That visibility was never our aim, but it was useful when it helped keep more rigorous training budgets intact. Rosa turned 3 on August 11, 2031. We marked the day by repeating the small rituals that mattered to us: a stack of picture books, a meal cooked with care, a photograph taken in the late afternoon light on the front steps. She did not yet understand the contours of family history. She understood, in ways children often do, the warmth of being held and the predictability of bedtime songs. Andrew and I kept the letter about limits on public retellings on the kitchen counter and resent it, gently, to extended relatives in September 2031 when a cousin posted a photograph of the family on a social app with an elusive caption. The cousin apologized when we pointed out the covenant. The incident became another small exercise in enforcing our commitments. Family commitments like ours tend to be upheld less by single proclamations than by daily recalibrations. Andrew continued to compose and to think about the ethics of sound. In March 2031, a chamber ensemble commissioned a short piece from him to be performed in a library series devoted to labor history. The program was scheduled for April 24, 2031, a date chosen to coincide with the anniversary of a strike in 1969. He wrote a quiet quartet that avoided direct quotation of the motif we had fought over and instead used a series of intervals that implied absence rather than presence. At the post-concert discussion, the ensemble's director invited a panel of workers and historians. For once, the music felt incidental to a conversation that had practical endpoints: preservation of oral histories, archival grants for workers' papers, a pledge by the library to digitize a set of union newsletters. I noted, then and later, how Andrew's careful musical choices could shape the texture of a conversation without becoming its dominant image. The Restorative Youth Project, by early 2032, had begun to show patterns that interested municipal funders. In February 2032, the county's Human Services Department renewed the 2-year grant early, committing funds through September 2034, conditional on a quarterly evaluation. The renewed funding allowed us to hire a part-time coordinator and to formalize the mentor program that had begun in October 2030. On April 2, 2032, we launched an evening workshop for mentors. The program used narrative writing exercises and role-play to help mentors practice attentive listening. The Mentor Corps, by mid-2033, numbered 35 and included several alumni who had returned as volunteers after finishing high school. Seeing young people teach young people, across the table from sticky notes and community pizza, felt like a small, stubborn victory against cycles of shame. Public institutions kept inching, too. In June 2032, a regional consortium of municipal ethics officers published a guidance brief on responsible public statements in cases of historical wrongdoing. The brief cited no single instance but included, among its examples, a set of suggested practices familiar to us: consult an ethicist before issuing statements that concern living persons, prioritize restorative processes, establish consent protocols for archival materials. The brief was not law, but it became part of a training module for newly hired communications officers in several counties through 2033. I understood these shifts the way a historian understands incremental legislation. They were not solutions but infrastructural changes that could, over time, change incentives. Our parents remained, in ways that did not fully resolve, part of that infrastructure of accountability and avoidance. They showed up for some family events and declined others. In the spring of 2033, my father attended a small birthday gathering for Rosa but left before dessert, claiming a sudden migraine. He later explained that the music in the room, a recording Andrew had made for a lullaby project in 2029, had been harder for him than he expected. My mother called on November 9, 2033, the anniversary of an event she treated privately, to say that she had been thinking about the harms she caused and that she wished to meet with me, Andrew, and a mediator. We scheduled a meeting for December 12, 2033, at a church hall with a trained facilitator present. The meeting was awkward and sincere in a way that required stamina. My mother offered a version of remorse that emphasized intent over impact, and the facilitator helped translate that into language we could use for practical restitution. We left with a list of small actions: a donation to a scholarship fund in the community where her choices had injured people, a written apology that would remain private unless we all agreed to share it, and a promise to attend periodic family mediation sessions. Those commitments were imperfect. They did not assuage all grievances. They did, however, change the terms of some conversations. The chapel recording continued to operate as a litmus test. In March 2034, a scholar asked to include a short excerpt in a documentary about music and ritual. We refused again. We believed that consent and context were not abstract principles but particular obligations. The scholar pivoted and used other examples. In May 2034, a local radio program ran an hour on restorative practices and asked Andrew for an interview. He declined to play the chapel piece but agreed to speak about consent and to play a short passage from his hospital training suite. The host, broadcasting from a public media studio on May 19, 2034, noted the difference between raw exposure and intentional, bounded use. That conversation, modest as it was, reached listeners who worked in healthcare and education, and two principals called the station afterward to ask for materials for staff training. The ripple effects were, again, practical rather than reputational. We kept careful records. The Restorative Youth Project's internal audit, published in October 2034, summarized 4 years of data and included both quantitative outcomes and qualitative narratives. The audit showed continued improvements in school attendance among participants, increased referrals to legal clinics when appropriate, and a higher rate of civic engagement among alumni. It also catalogued failures, missteps in facilitator training, a few public misreadings that forced us to clarify policies, and the persistent difficulty of funding long-term case management. We circulated the audit to funders and, quietly, to the County Ethics Office, which used some of the findings to refine training guidelines for social workers in late 2034. Andrew's musical life traced similar tensions between caution and engagement. In September 2034, he accepted a commission for a work to be performed at a memorial for a mining town's centennial. The commission required him to consult with families and labor historians. He spent the spring and early summer of 2034 interviewing descendants and reading archives. When he premiered the piece on September 15, 2034, he gave the program notes to the audience and insisted that the performance include a moment for descendants to speak. The program, held in a modest municipal auditorium, led to two concrete outcomes: a small endowment for the preservation of miners' oral histories and an anonymous gift to the local high school to fund vocational scholarships. The music did not erase the past. It helped redirect attention to reparative acts. In the household, habits hardened into rites. We observed a pattern of delaying public statements for 48 hours, as we had decided in 2030, and we convened our small circle of advisors whenever we considered sharing personal material. When a national outlet contacted us in January 2035 to ask about our experience with public shaming and healing, Andrew and I declined to participate in a long-form interview. We instead offered to provide background materials about program design, hoping that concrete resources would be more helpful than another human interest piece. The outlet published an editorial in February 2035 that mentioned our model in passing and linked to a toolkit on trauma-informed listening.